I'm not going to talk about physicians and charlatans, of course. I'm going to talk about a group of mainstream climate scientists, of whom I am one, and a smaller group of people called climate skeptics. But even that language is misleading because, as you know, all scientists are skeptical of received wisdom. And I'm not going to give you a list of skeptic arguments or their refutations. There are now websites that contain lists of websites that give the counter arguments. And you know, climate science is technical and it is ever changing. And there are a lot of useful analogies with medicine. Just think of the term global warming. It's analogous to the fever in a disease. It's not anything more than a symptom. It doesn't connote what you have and what to do about it. And there are a lot of other useful analogies, I think. For example, when you go to the doctor and she says you need to shape up, exercise more, eat less, stop drinking so much every night, you don't challenge the doctor and say, wait a minute, what day will my heart attack come and how severe will it be and what will the surgical options be then? You know that medicine, like climate science, is imperfect but still good enough to be useful. And I want to try to return to that theme a little later on. There are good physicians and charlatans and people in between, and there are skeptics in all fields of active science. That is, there are a lot of outliers from the mainstream. And I invite you to Google AIDS denier or AIDS skeptic, and you'll come up with the name of Peter Duesberg, who's a full professor at the University of California, Berkeley, a member of the National Academy of Science, had been tipped for the Nobel early in his career, and he's one of a small number of retrovirus experts, there's no doubt of it, his credentials, who doesn't think HIV causes AIDS. So an analogous question is, how do you evaluate his claim? I can tell you, and you'll find out, although this isn't my field at all, it's easy to find out, that he is regarded by the great majority of AIDS experts, and especially the clinical community, as somebody who is not only wrong, and not only has a closed mind and can't be reasoned with, but who has done great harm by providing cover for people like Mbeki of South Africa to deny the existence of an AIDS epidemic and to refuse to mount a program. And so it may not be too much to say that skeptics like Duesberg have blood on their hands. And I think it's important when you start thinking about climate skeptics, and if I have one message to get through, I hope you'll take this, to realize that we're not talking about something abstruse and cosmological. We're talking about something with real-world consequences. And if the skeptics are mistaken, then to the extent that they persuade policymakers and the public not to take this issue seriously, we have a planetary future to think about. And that's not an alarmist statement. I'm not exaggerating. We're not talking about a theological argument about angels dancing on a pin. We are talking about something with real-world consequences. I think also, and it's a personal anecdotal opinion if you like, that the science of climate is not the motivation for most skeptics, that instead they're concerned about the possible policy implications of taking the science seriously. It's clear and obvious that the segments of the fossil fuel industry feel threatened, so do its allies. But when you take a fact like the one we just heard a few minutes ago, that in the United States, Democrats predominantly take global warming seriously and are concerned about it, would like to see action, and a great majority of Republicans in Congress at least do not, then you begin to connect these motivations. It's not so much that they're concerned about the physics of clouds or sea level rise. They're concerned with the prospect of interference with free markets, of regulations, and with reduced national sovereignty. That's why, in fact, you often hear the Ipcc described as the United Nations says. You know, it's because United Nations is a dirty term for some people. I've learned in this country that something like 40% of Canadians think that climate change is attributable to natural cycles. And there are a number of Canadian climate skeptics who have in common these features that I've just talked about. The usual arguments are simply several categories. There are many, many subcategories to these. One is that global warming isn't occurring, that we don't have adequate measurements, that temperature measurements are contaminated by urban heat island and bad instrument placing and bad analysis, or that to the extent that it is occurring, we don't know why, but C, since we've seen temperature go up and down for millennia, it's a natural cycle, and in any case, it's not that bad, especially a country like Canada. What's wrong with having longer growing seasons and warmer weather? And even if all those first four things aren't true, we're powerless to stop it. And there's an industry, you might say, based on that. And in fact, all of these views have long ago been rejected by the mainstream community, and the arguments and counter-arguments, as I said, are easy to find. But they don't die, they don't go away. Nobody drives a stake in them, as in many other science versus other issues or other ways of looking at the world, like evolution and creationism. And it's, I think, easy to dismiss this as due to science illiteracy. That certainly plays a role. Ideology does too. But in the case of climate science, and this is not true in the AIDS-HIV controversy, if you want to think about it that way. In the case of climate science, there is an extremely well-funded, extremely effective disinformation campaign, exactly analogous to the one mounted by the tobacco industry to deny the connections between smoking and health some years ago. Tactics are identical, and in fact, some of the same people are involved. Now, on the other theme I want to talk about today is the existence of an organization that, to my knowledge, and I've talked to lots of historians of science about this, doesn't have an exact parallel in any other field where science meets policy. And that's the Ipcc. It's coming on to 20 years old. Its mandate is very strict. It's not there to inform you or the media. It's there to inform policymakers and to do so in a way that's relevant to their charge but isn't policy prescriptive. Ipcc doesn't advocate, ever, any policy course. It's a UN agency in the sense that it has a tiny office in in Geneva, and a skeleton staff. Its job really is to organize large numbers of scientists from all over the world. I'll say a good deal about how that's done. In its 20 years, it has produced many reports, including 4 major climate assessment reports, the latest of which has appeared this year. We don't know, because it hasn't been out long enough for it to have, you might say, run the gamut of all the critics, but its predecessor, the 3rd report, was endorsed by the National Academy of Science in the US, the Royal Society in England, their counterparts in other countries, professional scientist organizations like the American Meteorological Society, American Geophysical Union, American Association for the Advancement of Science. They've all said, yes, this report fairly represents mainstream thinking. There are 3 working groups, and I'm going to speak today, for time limitations, only about the first one that's concerned with the physical basis of climate science, not with the second and third ones that deal with adapting to climate change or mitigating it. The groups work independently. It's the first one that I've been spending half my time on for the last 3 years. I invite you to this website. Sometimes I think one of the weird asymmetries about this subject is that as soon as a skeptic comes up with a new weird idea about some magical negative feedback that makes the climate system robust against change, he wants me to stop what I'm doing and read it and comment on it and explain why he's wrong. But he hasn't gone to the Ipcc report and pointed out which of its many conclusions, which of its 1,000 pages he finds an objection to. The skeptics also tend not to run in peer-reviewed literature and so on. Tim Ball, the fellow at the list of the Canadian skeptics, is somebody who hasn't published anything in the peer-reviewed literature for the last 14 years, as far as is known. But he does do a lot of talking, some of which is funded by PR agencies working for the Alberta oil patch. I invite you to download this full 1,000-page report, or if you don't have the stomach for that, download the 20-page summary of Working Group 1 of AR4. The Ipcc resembles the Army in that it has lots of jargon, lots of hierarchy, lots of abbreviations. The 3rd report, known in the trade as the TAR, as I said, is regarded as the gold standard. But why? I think we're here to talk about trust in science, and what justifies the assertion that this report fairly represents the findings of climate science insofar as that they're relevant to policy. The first thing to note is that Ipcc, and this, as I said, was set up some 20 years ago with the agreement of all the world's governments, and it has a very strict and prescribed mandate. It doesn't conduct research. although because it's become so prominent now, it influences the research. The climate modeling groups of the world are saying, well, let's see, the new report will come out in about 2013. I'll have to have the results published by 2011. That means I have to freeze my climate model by 2008 and get the computer time to run things. The IPCC mandate is to assess, and you see all those noble words after it: comprehensive, objective, open, transparent, and assess the peer-reviewed literature. The IPCC doesn't assess anything, never mentions anything that's not in the peer-reviewed technical literature. It's not assessing speculation or hunches or anything else. And as I said, it's not driven or prescriptive of policy. Doubt is our product has been mentioned many times here. It came from Brown and Williamson, the tobacco company. But it's clear, and again, you can find out this in an hour on the web, it's clear that the disinformation campaign run by the, as I said, parts of the fossil fuel industry and its political allies, very, very closely modeled this on the tobacco one. The IPCC talks a lot about uncertainty, and it uses technical language that's calibrated. I'll show you an example of that momentarily. And in some cases, and it distinguishes carefully between uncertainty in the sense of expert judgment and uncertainty as an inference from data or from mathematical models. Here's an example. Sea level rise happens when the climate warms, and you can explain this to a 6-year-old. It happens because the ocean, like lots of other things, takes up more space when it's warmer. It expands thermally. And also, ice on land melts and ends up flowing into the ocean. For two separate, well-understood reasons, sea level rises. And this is a huge number. In the ice ages, when the opposite happened, sea level was 100 meters lower. Not a few centimeters, 100 meters. And we can model and we can measure how sea level is doing, and we can quantitatively predict for a given rate of warming of the climate, by whatever cause, the sun or whatever you like, how much sea level will rise. But then there are other mechanisms that can happen too. For example, if you melted all the ice in Greenland, and Al Gore made the mistake in his movie of creating the impression this might happen very soon, but if you were to melt all the ice in Greenland, you raise sea level by 7 meters. But you don't have to wait a long time for that, because sometimes abrupt changes, tipping points, instabilities, whatever term you like, happen, and chunks of ice get lubricated by meltwater flowing through crevasses and lubricating the place where the ice is grounded on the bedrock, and big chunks of ice fall into the sea and rise sea level quickly. We don't have a theory of that. We can't model it. The physics aren't well enough understood. So the IPCC, which I think is sometimes unjustly accused of imposing consensus, says about sea level, if you read the report, we can say two things. One is thermal expansion and slow melting of ice on land will raise sea level by something like 18 to 59 centimeters over the rest of this century, but there's another mechanism, the destabilization of ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. We don't know that. It's an active research area. Watch it, but we can't put numbers on it. Hurricanes is another clear example. Hurricanes are heat engines. They get their energy from the warm tropical ocean. In a warmer world, there's more energy. Hurricanes don't even form when the sea surface temperature is below a certain threshold value. And so there are reasons, theoretical and practical, to think that hurricanes may become more intense. The stronger storms may become more intense. But this, too, is an area of active research, and it takes a long time because hurricanes, thankfully, are rare to generate stable statistics. As has been mentioned earlier, you can't ascribe in a definitive way a particular weather event like Katrina to global warming, but it changes the odds, it changes the probabilities. I'll say a word or two about the process. This 20-page summary for policymakers, we drafted it, and then the IPCC plenary met in Paris, and over a long week of late nights approved it word by word. So the scientists were there. We didn't ever lose control of the science. The governments were there to nuance the wordsmithing. Here's a picture of what happened. This is a room in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower behind the military school where Napoleon went. The tragedy of it all was that we worked until midnight and were fed soggy sandwiches with 2-star restaurants right across the street. But you can see, by the way, here, that these are the lead authors in the front, and each time their part of the report was under discussion, they were on the podium answering questions, making sure, so that, for example, the delegates, and this functions as a mini UN General Assembly, parliamentary procedure, business ware, and so on, simultaneous translation into the 6 UN languages. The delegates could say sea level rise is serious, a matter of concern, important, bears watching, but they couldn't say it was trivial or impossible or unlikely. I'll just flash a few typical figures. There are 7 figures from the summary for policymakers, and the delegates, again, get to choose things like how thick the lines are. The top figure here shows how temperature has been rising over essentially the period since 1850 on the left. That's as long a reliable instrumental record as we have. And here's the rapid rise in recent decades. At the same time, sea level has been rising. The blue area indicates uncertainty. The circles are the annual numbers. The red line at the end is satellite data grafted onto older measurements and time gauges. You can see northern hemisphere snow cover sinking. Remember, the cutoff date was July of 2006, so the new results about the Arctic ice reaching an all-time low were not there. You saw a version of this earlier. Here, for each of the 6 inhabited continents and for the ocean area of the world, the land area, and the combined area, you see the observed rise. So you see it's ubiquitous. The temperature is rising rapidly in recent decades on all the inhabited continents, less in the ocean than in the land, as you would expect. That's why on a hot day, it's cooler in the sea than on the beach. The blue and the pink line are computer simulations, the blue line taking into account only natural factors, for example, variations in the sun or volcanoes, and the pink area including computer simulations in which man-made effects like pollution and greenhouse gases were included. So it's part of the evidence for the attribution statement that I'll show you in a moment that human activities are mainly responsible. The 1,000-page report gets narrowed down to a 20-page summary, and the media being what it is, that gets narrowed down to one statement. So this is the headline statement of the second report. If it looks like lawyerly negotiated language, it is, because the governments came up with. The rule here, by the way, is unanimous consent. If a single government digs in its heels and objects to a phrase or a word, it doesn't get in the report. By 6 years ago, you get this statement here. There's new and stronger evidence that most of the warming in the last half century is human caused. There were 2 such statements that came out here. I have to tell you, even though we're short of time, unequivocal got haggled over. And one delegate from a country, not Canada, where French was one of the official languages, said you couldn't say unequivocal in French. And the French delegate got up, purple in the face, and standing there in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower next to Napoleon's school said, you can say unequivocal. The sacred French language is fully capable of expressing that thought. And so it's in there, sans équivoque. As is now evident from observations of increases in global average, not only air temperatures, but ocean temperatures, melting snow and ice, rising global average sea level. So you're not just seeing a warming air. And the second headline statement was that most of the increase over the last half century is very likely, which is calibrated language, meaning at least 9 chances out of 10, due to observed increase in human-caused greenhouse gases. So once again, that's a statement that the scientists drafted and that the governments unanimously approved. Here's some of the evidence. Again, I'm just showing you this to give you the flavor of what these reports are like. Okay? And I invite you to go to the Ipcc website and download them. They're all PDF files, free for nothing. This is a 10,000-year record of carbon dioxide. We know what it was in the distant past from air trapped in ice cores. And this is the modern record here. So it was around 280 for thousands of years in these units, and it's above 380 now. So better than 1 out of 4 CO2 molecules is human caused. We know this rise is entirely due to human activity. For you chemists, the isotopic signature of fossil fuel carbon is different from natural carbon. And the other 2 figures are for methane and nitrous oxide, the next 2 most important anthropogenic greenhouse gases. For the skeptics who say the sun is doing it, not carbon dioxide, we measure that. We've been measuring the solar intensity from satellites, and as you can see, if you can read the numbers, it's an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 smaller than that due to CO2. So there's lots of stuff here. I give the Ipcc a great grade for science assessment and mediocre for communication, because this is their idea of something boiled down and non-technical. LOSU, by the way, L-O-S-U for level of scientific understanding. You like that? There's a lot of evidence here, and I'm not going to have time to read this slide to you, but this is an example, paraphrases of statements taken from the summary for policymakers. Notice the ocean is warming. North Atlantic hurricanes, where we have the best observations, have intensified in a statistically significant way since 1970. And there are projections. The Ipcc doesn't predict the future, but it does what-if experiments. If a certain level of greenhouse gas emissions from a certain level of population happen, this or that will happen. That gives you this range of 20 to 60 centimeters without ice sheet dynamics and so on. And a continued warming at a rate of 0.2 of a degree. This is the acidity statement. The Ipcc thinks policymakers know what pH units are. That's just fine. They don't, they should. And so the ocean is acidifying because the CO2 ends up in the water. You know, it's a dilute carbonic acid. So that's the kind of forecast that's made. Again, these are highlights. I'd like to, in closing, got a minute or two left, say a few words about this kind of thing. Here you're looking for the various scenarios. Aren't these catchy names? These are the scenarios so that A2 is business as usual. That means you and your friends keep on having babies and keep on making 80% of the world's energy from fossil fuels. You get this much warming. And for scenarios with greater efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you get this much warming. And these are from computer simulations. But here's what that means in terms of geographical distribution. You notice on this is important for policymakers. Here's 2000, here's 2100. The curves don't split very much in the first 2 or 3 decades of the current century, but they're far apart at the end. And you can see that here. Here are maps of the warming. These are probability distributions. So in the decade of the 2020s, there's not much difference between business as usual, the bottom one here, and strong reductions of emissions. But by the end of the century, this is the last 10 years, you get here, the darker the red, the greater the warming. At this point, there's much greater warming on all the continents. The Arctic ice is, seasonal sea ice is gone and so on. So the difference between this and this is big. So the actions now, again, it's much like medicine, the painful actions now, stop smoking today, have important consequences decades down the road. Here's the last figure I'll show. These are precipitation changes. The stippled areas are ones where the computer models agree and where the confidence is therefore higher. And you see the brown is less rain, the blue is more rain. In general, a reduction in precipitation in the subtropics where the great deserts of the world already are, like the desert southwest in the US or the Sahara, and greater rainfall at high latitudes. Again, observed trends show this is already happening. I'll say until the chair tells me I have to stop. Got another minute? One more minute? One more minute. That there are this report was written, the Working Group 1 report, by 152 lead authors. There are 11 chapters. Each chapter had 2 heads. They're called coordinating lead authors. It's very much like the Army. I'm a coordinating lead author. We were the ones who were in Paris. And these people are not self-selected. They were chosen by author nominations from the government. So it wasn't, my mom who nominated me. It was the National Science Foundation. And there's all kinds of diversity, not only from discipline and gender and so on, but fully a quarter of them were young in the sense of being less than 10 years past the PhD when appointed. 3/4, like me, were Ipcc virgins, so we didn't have any compunction to defend the previous reports. And more than 1/3 were from developing countries, so it wasn't in any sense elderly white males from rich countries. We wrote 3 drafts over 3 years, and they went out for review to experts and to governments. An expert, you could write into Ipcc and say, I'm an expert, and get as much of the report you wanted. The US government put the drafts on a public website. We received more than 30,000 review comments. Every one was logged, numbered, and responded to. The responses are public. And I think, to return to our theme of this meeting, that a lot of the trust and a lot of the stature and the respect given to this report come from this open to all, transparent to anyone attribute of the process. It's peer-reviewed to death. Probably your last paper that you academics published, you got less than 30,000 comments. And the credentials of the authors, Nobel Prize winner, National Medal of Science winner, members of the Royal Society and all that. And the UN seems to agree with us. Thank you.